Night falls, and a lone cowboy hears desperate cries. Wolves circling a giant woman, her fate uncertain. He fights through the shadows, saving her life, but knows nothing will stay quiet for long. By sunrise, the valley trembles with the arrival of 200 warriors, their faces unreadable, their intentions hidden. The chief approaches, and the cowboy braces himself, knowing that what comes next could either reward him or destroy him. The sun dipped behind jagged peaks, bleeding its last light across a sky thick with rolling storm clouds. Shadows crept down the narrow mountain pass, curling over rocky ledges and whispered crevices. The wind cut sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint tang of blood. Somewhere below, a howl sliced through the growing darkness. Raw, urgent, and hungry, a lone cowboy rode steadily, spurs ringing against his horse's flanks. His silhouette was long against the dying light, a man worn by dust, loss, and endless miles of solitude. The rifle slung across his back caught the glint of the last sunlight, a faint promise of survival in a land where promises were often broken. Then it came, a scream high, pitched and ragged, tearing through the valley like a knife. The horse shied, snorting, and the cowboy's hand tightened on the reins. His heart hammered in the silence that followed, broken only by snapping branches and the low growl of unseen predators. Through the haze of storm and shadow, he saw her, a figure vast and human, shaped, trapped in a circling pack of wolves. Their eyes glinted in the twilight, teeth bared, muscles coiled to strike. She stood tall and trembling, yet unbowed, a giant among the wild, her long hair matted with blood and dew. The earth itself seemed to quake under the weight of the moment. Without hesitation, the cowboy nudged his horse forward. Dust rose like smoke around the animals, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white streaks, illuminating the terrifying tableau. Wolves lunged, snapping at his horse's flanks, but he pressed on, every nerve alight, every muscle straining. He swung his rifle, not to kill, but to protect. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the canyon, scattering some of the pack, but others pressed closer. The giant woman pivoted with surprising agility, her enormous hands swinging, striking down wolves with bone, crushing force. She wasn't helpless. She was fierce. She was fire given form. Rain began to hiss against the stones, cold and stinging, turning the earth into mud. The cowboy felt the pull of fear, but it was drowned out by a more stubborn current. Duty, a strange, unreasoning code to defend a stranger. Each heartbeat was thunder, each breath a cloud of determination in the stormy dusk. He dove from his horse as a wolf lunged, rolling across slick rock. Claws slashed the air where he had been, and the smell of wet fur and blood filled his senses. The giant woman's eyes met his for the briefest instant, and in that look was recognition, a silent plea, a wordless trust. The storm's first crack of thunder shook the canyon, echoing the chaos below. Wolves scattered momentarily, but the danger was far from over. The cowboy rose, soaked and bruised, his rifle steady. Around them the world was chaos, wind screaming, rain drumming, wolves circling, the dying sun's fire smothered by clouds. And yet, amid it all, a fragile tether formed. Human courage entwined with giant strength, a bond born in desperation. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the choice he was making carried weight beyond that night, beyond this pass, beyond the mountains themselves. To save her was to step into a story he could never leave, a path that would carve its mark into both their fates. The first sparks of lightning illuminated the wolf pack one last time. They hesitated. The giant woman took a step forward, her shadow long and unstoppable. And in that suspended heartbeat, the cowboy understood. Survival wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her. It was about the code he had sworn to live by, even when the world offered no witnesses. And then, with a roar that mingled thunder and human resolve, he charged, diving fully into the storm, into the teeth of wolves, into the heart of a night that would decide everything. Rain pelted down in sheets, soaking the cowboy to the bone, slicking the rocks beneath his boots. The wolves circled, low growls vibrating through the canyon walls, eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. The giant woman shifted beside him, massive and unyielding, her every movement a mix of caution and raw power. He ducked as a wolf lunged, claws raking the air where his shoulder had been seconds before. The rifle's stock hit the ground with a crack, but instinct took over, fists swinging, rolling, shoving back against the pack's hunger. The giant woman moved with terrifying grace, her hands sending two wolves crashing into the mud, their snarls swallowed by the roar of the storm. Lightning split the sky again, a white, hot flash that revealed the sheer magnitude of the scene, a valley alive with chaos, water running in rivulets down jagged rocks, and the desperate struggle of two figures against nature's teeth. The cowboy's lungs burned, his muscles screamed, yet he pressed forward. Fear was irrelevant now, only purpose remained. A sudden snap of a branch behind them made him whirl. A wolf, larger than the rest, had flanked them, eyes fixed and calculating. The giant woman roared, a sound that shook the very stones, and with a single monumental sweep, she sent the creature tumbling backward, its howl cut short in the mud. Breathing hard, the cowboy caught a glimpse of her face. She was terrified, yes, but defiant, ties blazing, chest rising and falling like the rhythm of the mountains themselves. He realized then that this was no ordinary woman. She was a force of nature, trapped, yes, but not broken. The remaining wolves hesitated, their circling tightening but wary. The cowboy seized the moment, grabbing the woman's arm and pulling her toward a narrow rock chute that led higher up the ridge. Mud squelched beneath their boots, rain slicking hair plastered to their faces, but momentum carried them forward. Every step was a gamble, every breath a defiance of death. Thunder rolled overhead, closer now, rattling the stones like war drums. He felt the weight of destiny press down, the choice to fight, to protect, to save someone who could never be replaced. The giant woman's hand brushed his, a fleeting connection of trust. It was enough. Halfway up the ridge, a wolf lunged from behind a boulder. The cowboy turned, catching its teeth with the butt of his rifle, sending it crashing to the ground. He rolled, scrambled, rose again. The storm, the wolves, the mud. All of it was a blur. Only the goal mattered, survival, only the choice mattered, to act when all else fled. Finally, they reached a ledge high above the valley floor. Below, the wolf pack circled, frustrated, snarling, unable to breach the narrow ascent. The cowboy slumped against a rock, chest heaving, rain washing blood and dirt from his skin. The giant woman, towering and soaked, watched the storm with cautious eyes. She was free for the moment, alive, but the bond between them had been forged in fire, in rain, in teeth and claw. A long silence followed, broken only by the distant drum of thunder. He realized that what had started as an act of desperation had become a choice he could never undo. By saving her, he had changed something in himself, a code, a moral reckoning, a spark that would light the path ahead. Lightning flashed one last time over the canyon, illuminating the giant woman in stark relief against the blackened sky. Her eyes met his, a silent acknowledgement of shared survival, of courage tested, of a story just beginning. And in that moment, as the storm raged and the wolves retreated into shadow, the cowboy understood fully. The night was theirs, but the dawn would demand even more. The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of wet fur and distant pine. Somewhere far below, the valley held its breath, and above, on the rain-slick ridge, two figures stood, strangers bound by circumstance, courage, and the first tremors of an extraordinary bond. Dawn crept slowly over the mountains, pale light spilling through lingering clouds, softening the jagged edges of the ridge. Rain. Slick rocks glimmered like molten silver under the early sun, and the air carried the crisp scent of wet pine and earth. The valley below was quiet now, silent but for the distant drip of melting water, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. The cowboy sat against a boulder, muscles still trembling from the fight, mind replaying every snap of teeth, every howl that had torn through the darkness. Blood and mud clung to him, a testament to survival, yet his thoughts wandered beyond the storm, beyond the wolves, to years he had tried to forget. He remembered the first winter he had lost his family, the fire that swallowed their cabin whole while he had been out tracking horses. The screams had lingered in his ears longer than the smoke in the chimney, haunting every empty valley he crossed thereafter. Each decision since had been a balancing act between survival and regret. Every choice a measure of debts unpaid and promises broken. The giant woman, leaning against a nearby rock, her enormous frame dwarfed only by the mountains themselves, watched him quietly. She did not speak yet, but the cowboy could sense her presence, a solid anchor in the fragile calm. There was a silent understanding forming, a recognition of shared scars of lives shaped by violence and loss. He flexed his fingers, feeling the soreness of a night spent wrestling with wolves, and thought of the people he had failed before. Friends who had trusted him, families who had counted on him. Their faces floated briefly in his mind, blurred by the smoke of memory. Each one a reminder that courage was not a guarantee, only a choice. The woman shifted slightly, the sound of her boots against wet stone grounding him in the present. Her eyes, dark and deep, followed his gaze as if reading the lines carved into his face by time and hardship. There was something about her silence that reminded him of the empty cabin, the echoing hallways where laughter had once lived and now only shadows remained. A distant howl carried across the ridge, thin and mournful. The cowboy flinched, a reflex, but then let it pass, realizing the wolves were no longer immediate threats. It was a sound that reminded him of every loss, every moment he had been powerless to protect those who mattered. Yet, unlike before, he was not alone. He had chosen to act, to step into danger not for gain, but for justice, for life. Memories of past betrayals surfaced. Men who had turned on him for silver, friends who had vanished when the storms came, leaving only hollow words behind. And beneath it all, a quiet shame, the sense that courage alone could not undo the past. It could only shape the present, and perhaps, just perhaps, carve a path toward redemption. The giant woman shifted closer, her massive form brushing against the edge of the boulder he leaned upon. The contact was subtle, but it carried weight, a silent acknowledgement of trust. He caught the movement of her lips, the faintest whisper of a sound, a language he did not yet understand, yet somehow felt in his bones. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the rain's final drops wash over him. The storm had passed, the wolves had retreated, but the echoes of what he had endured, loss, regret, fear, still thrummed through his chest. The woman's presence, immense and unwavering, became a mirror to his own inner strength, a reminder that even in the shadow of death, the choice to protect and endure was still his. Rising slowly, he stretched and took in the valley below. Mist curled among the trees, softening the scars of the land. Every choice, every act of courage was a step forward, a defiance of the silence that had once claimed him. And in that quiet dawn he felt the faint stirring of resolve that he would not run, not again. Not when another soul depended on him. A flash of lightning far on the horizon lit the clouds in brief, spectral silver, as if the sky itself acknowledged the fragile peace. The cowboy turned to the giant woman, nodding subtly. She returned the gesture, slow and deliberate, a bond forming without words. They were survivors. They were bound now by circumstance and choice, and the echoes of the past, though sharp, would not dictate their future. The wind whispered through the ridge, carrying with it the scent of wet pine, distant earth, and something more elusive, possibility. And as the first rays of sun struck the peaks, painting them in gold, the cowboy felt it in his chest. The stirring of a moral compass realigned, the quiet, insistent call of purpose that would carry them both forward into the unknown. The cowboy stood, water dripping from his hat brim, boots sinking slightly into the mud as he moved along the ridge. Each step was deliberate, careful, his body still carrying the soreness of the night's fight, his mind weighed with the gravity of memory. The giant woman followed, her strides measured, each footfall sending small tremors through the soaked earth. He glanced at her, noting the quiet intensity in her gaze. She had been silent since the night's chaos, yet her presence resonated, a reminder that strength did not always need words, and that courage often came in forms larger than the body alone. Her hair clung in dark strands to her neck, rainwater dripping in rivulets down her shoulders, yet she stood unbowed, as immovable as the cliffs that framed the valley. The cowboy's thoughts drifted again to the faces of those he had failed long ago. The boy whose horse had stumbled into the river, the partner who had fallen in a gunfight he hadn't foreseen, the quiet mother who had waited for him in vain. Every failure was a stone in his chest, pressing him down, reminding him that courage alone was never enough. Yet here, in the soft light of dawn, he felt a strange shift. He had acted decisively, without hesitation, to protect another life, and in that act, a fragment of redemption had taken root. A raven croaked from a nearby pine, startling a flock into the rising mist. The sound carried across the valley, a sharp punctuation in the soft morning air. He realized how long it had been since he had felt this way, not merely surviving, but consciously choosing to stand, to act, to protect. The weight of history, of grief and regret, still lingered, but it was tempered by resolve, by the raw, undeniable sense of moral purpose. The giant woman turned toward him, eyes catching the first sunlight, revealing a depth of emotion he could scarcely decipher. There was caution, yes, but also something quieter, steadier, the recognition that he had risked everything for her, that in the chaos of wolves and storm he had not faltered. The understanding was unspoken, yet absolute. They were no longer merely strangers bound by circumstance. They were allies, linked by necessity and by choice. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn trinket, a carved wooden horse, its edges smoothed by time and handling. It was a fragment of the boy he had once tried to save, a relic of failures past. He turned it over in his hand, thinking of all that had led him to this ridge, to this storm, to this woman. Perhaps courage was not the absence of fear, he realized, but the persistence of action in spite of it. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from a distant valley, a hint of danger, a whisper of the world beyond the ridge. He felt the pull of responsibility tighten. The giant woman was not just a stranger. She was a life that had been entrusted to him, a moral burden he could neither ignore nor abandon. Every memory of past loss sharpened his resolve rather than weakening it. As they began descending toward a sheltered grove, the mist clinging to the ground like a living thing, the cowboy's thoughts settled into a quiet rhythm. Reflection gave way to planning, grief gave way to purpose. He understood that this dawn was not simply the end of a night of terror. It was the beginning of a path he would have to walk fully, with every choice carrying weight, every act measured by honor, courage, and the lives entrusted to him. The giant woman's gaze followed the valley floor, alert and unyielding. The cowboy met her eyes, and for a fleeting moment the past and future collided, the ghosts of failure mingling with the promise of redemption. And in that shared silence, the first real trust between them was forged, unspoken but undeniable, a fragile ember in the heart of a world that demanded action, not apology. Above them, the sky cleared in patches of blue, sunlight striking the wet pine needles and casting them in gold. The storm had passed, but the echoes remain, echoes of grief, of guilt, of choices once avoided. Yet now the cowboy felt a subtle shift in their weight. He would carry them forward, yes, but not as chains. They would guide him, sharpen him, drive him to protect what must be saved, to act when the world threatened to collapse into darkness. And as the morning mist began to lift, revealing the valley in quiet splendor, the cowboy knew one thing with certainty. The giant woman was no longer just a survivor of wolves. She was a spark, a reason to face what the day might bring, and the first chapter of a story that would test every measure of courage, morality, and heart he had left. Dawn's mist lingered in the valley like a delicate veil, curling around pines and rocks, softening edges and muting color. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of wet earth, resin, and rain, washed stone. The cowboy moved cautiously along the ridge, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, every step deliberate. Behind him the giant woman stirred, her massive frame shifting like the slow sway of an ancient tree, cautious yet unbroken. Her eyes opened, vast and luminous, catching the morning light with a bewildered brilliance. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream that had spanned centuries. The memory of wolves, the snapping teeth, the rain, the raw terror, still clung to her in shivering ripples. Yet beneath that fear, a deep and unyielding strength began to surface. The cowboy observed her quietly, noting the way her gaze swept the valley, the careful measurement of each shadow, each movement in the mist. She was aware, alert, and yet profoundly disoriented, a creature caught between the remnants of night's terror and the fragile promise of dawn. She spoke, her voice a low rumble, accented with tones unfamiliar, melodic yet commanding. He did not understand the words, but the intention was clear. Caution, inquiry, a challenge wrapped in sound. He replied with measured gestures, a slow raise of his hands, then a nod, a gentle tilt of the head. His own silent language of trust. Sunlight pierced the fog in golden shafts, illuminating her form in startling clarity. Towering, broad-shouldered, her hair cascading like a waterfall of dark silk. She seemed almost otherworldly against the muted greens and grays of the valley. Birds scattered in flurries at her movement, startled by the sheer magnitude of her presence, as if nature itself hesitated before her. The cowboy stepped closer, careful not to startle, offering water from his canteen. She took it, her hands enveloping it with a grip that could crush stone. Yet she drank with a hesitant gentleness that revealed both awareness and curiosity. Each motion spoke volumes, caution balanced with instinctual trust, awe mingling with latent power. He remembered the stories his father had whispered around the fire. Tales of mountain giants, hidden tribes, warriors whose strength was as vast as the lands they roamed. He had never believed them. And yet, here she was, not legend, not rumor, but flesh and bone, a living testament to a world he barely understood. She gestured toward the ridge and the distant peaks, her hands slicing the air with deliberate, careful movements. He followed her eyes, catching glimpses of something unseen. A hidden path, perhaps, or a danger lurking just beyond the mist. There was an unspoken message. She was not merely lost, she was hunted, and the mountains themselves whispered threats in her presence. The cowboy realized the enormity of the choice he had made. To protect her was no longer a matter of courage. It was a matter of survival, of strategy, of understanding a world that existed beyond his experience. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt a surge of wonder, a rare, piercing curiosity that mingled with fear. Her voice rose again, a melodic cadence he could not decipher, yet he felt the rhythm, the intention, the plea. Slowly he began to mimic her gestures, careful and deliberate, bridging the gap between worlds with patience and observation. The mist swirled around them, the valley holding its breath as two leaves. One grounded in the known, the other vast and mysterious. Began the slow, fragile dance of understanding. A hawk cried overhead, slicing through the shafts of sunlight like a silver arrow. The giant woman's head tilted, following its path, and for a brief moment the tension melted, replaced by a shared recognition of something larger than themselves. They were not alone in the world, and yet the mountains offered no promises. Only choice, only courage, only the tentative beginnings of trust. As the sun climbed, illuminating pine tips and glistening rocks, the cowboy felt a shift in the valley's energy. The giant woman's stance softened, her eyes flicking to him in acknowledgement. Communication would be slow, painstaking, but it was possible. And in that realization, he felt the first spark of hope. The knowledge that two beings, bound by danger and choice, might yet face the shadows together. The mist began to lift, revealing more of the valley's secret paths, jagged ridges, and hidden alcoves. Somewhere within them lay the answers to questions unspoken, threats unseen, and a story that was only beginning to unfold. And in the quiet, fragile dawn, the cowboy understood. The night of wolves had ended, but the journey into the unknown had only just begun. The mist thinned further, drifting like ghostly ribbons between the trees, revealing the valley in soft, muted greens and browns. Every rock, every fallen branch seemed more vivid now, as if the world itself held its breath, watching the tentative dance unfolding between man and giant. The cowboy crouched low, careful to meet her gaze at eye level as much as he could, showing no threat, only patience. The giant woman's eyes followed him, dark pools of intelligence and instinct reflecting the flickering sunlight. Each movement she made was deliberate, measured power tempered by wariness. He could see the remnants of last night's terror in the tense lines of her shoulders, but beneath it lay a quiet resilience that made his chest tighten with both awe and admiration. She stepped forward, each footfall causing the soft earth to tremble beneath them, yet her motions carried a cautious grace as if she were testing the world as much as it was testing her. Her gaze swept the horizon, noting paths, shadows, and hidden corners of the valley. It was a map written in instinct and memory, and he realized she was far more than she appeared, far more than a survivor of wolves. She was a guardian of secrets, a living vessel of stories that had been hunted into silence. The cowboy offered a hand, palm open, an unspoken gesture of alliance. She hesitated, head tilting as her dark eyes measured him, reading intention, gauging risk. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she reached out, and their hands met, not quite fully, but enough. A bridge had been formed, a first promise. She spoke again, low and resonant, and though he could not understand the words, the rhythm, the urgency, and the emotion were unmistakable. She was alerting him, guiding him, sharing fragments of thought through gestures, sound, and presence. Each movement was a clue, a story, a warning. He mirrored her actions carefully, nodding, tilting, pointing, each gesture a step toward mutual understanding. The cowboy's mind wandered briefly to the nights of his own past, loss, betrayal, the harsh winters that had carved solitude into his soul. And yet, here was a living reminder that strength could exist outside human measure, that courage was not confined to men alone. In her, he saw the echo of his own convictions, unyielding, unbroken, and determined to survive. A distant rumble of thunder hinted at weather yet to come, and a hawk wheeled high above, casting a fleeting shadow across the valley floor. The giant woman followed its path, the lines of her face softening in fleeting wonder. The cowboy realized then that curiosity, the spark of awe, could be a weapon as powerful as any rifle or fist. It could forge alliances, inspire trust, and illuminate paths hidden in shadow. They moved slowly together toward a natural alcove sheltered by boulders and pines, a place where they could pause and assess. Every step was careful, deliberate, a choreography of caution and emerging trust. The cowboy noted the strength in her arms, the awareness in her eyes, the latent fire in her posture. And in that awareness, he felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. Protecting her was no longer an act of heroism. It was a necessity, a moral code he had pledged silently in the storm's heart. She crouched beside him in the alcove, her immense frame almost filling the space, yet she moved with the care of one attuned to the world's fragility. He reached into his pack and offered her dried meat, water, and a small cloth to wipe the mud from her hands. She accepted these gifts slowly, deliberately, as if measuring their worth. And in this silent exchange, a rhythm began to form, Trust measured in small acts, communication found in gestures, understanding born in patience. As the sun climbed higher, piercing the mist and illuminating the valley in streaks of gold, the cowboy sensed a subtle shift. She was no longer merely a victim of the wolves. She was aware, alert, and curious. She had begun to assess the man who had risked himself to save her, to measure his resolve, his character, his heart. And in her eyes he saw the first flicker of recognition, not just of survival, but of possibility, of alliance, of a story yet unwritten. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, distant fire, and untold dangers lying beyond the ridge. The cowboy understood that the night of terror had forged more than survival. It had forged a bond. The giant woman's awakening was not just physical. It was the birth of awareness, strategy, and trust that would carry them both forward into a world poised between shadow and light. And in that quiet, sun-dappled alcove, he made a silent vow. No matter what lay ahead, he would stand, he would protect, he would endure. For in her awakening, he had seen the beginning of something larger than either of them. A test of courage, morality, and heart that the frontier demanded of all who dared to face it. The rain had ceased, leaving the valley slick and glistening under a muted gray sky. Jagged rocks caught the scattered light, slick with lingering moisture, and the air smelled of pine, mud, and distant smoke. The cowboy stood at the edge of a narrow canyon, the giant woman beside him, her shadow stretching long across the wet stone. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the echoes of the storm and the ghosts of last night's struggle. He surveyed the path ahead, jagged cliffs and treacherous slopes cutting through the valley like the teeth of some ancient beast. Each step forward was a choice between survival and danger, caution and necessity. The giant woman watched him closely, her eyes reflecting a careful calculation. Trust mingled with instinct, strength measured against threat. The cowboy felt the weight of his decision pressing down. To escort her to safety meant leaving the solitude he had clung to for years, stepping into unknown territory where the world offered no guarantees. To retreat meant abandoning her, leaving her to face hunters, wolves, and the wilderness alone, a moral compromise he could not bear. Thunder rumbled softly from distant peaks, a low vibration that shook the rocks beneath their feet. He tightened his grip on his rifle, not out of fear, but as a talisman, a reminder of what it meant to act decisively in a world governed by danger. Around them, the wind carried the scent of wet stone and pine, mingling with the faint coppery tang of blood from the wolves' attack. Lingering proof that choice had consequences. The giant woman shifted, massive form moving with surprising subtlety. She looked to him, and in her gaze he read recognition, that he had chosen to risk himself, that he had acted without hesitation, and that now she relied on him to guide the next steps. She spoke in her low, melodic tone, words he could not comprehend, but the urgency was unmistakable. She gestured toward the canyon below, toward paths that led deeper into danger yet promised potential sanctuary. The cowboy exhaled slowly, letting his chest expand against the damp air. He thought of all the times he had chosen safety over action, solitude over responsibility, and how those choices had cost him dearly. The memory of loss pressed against him like a cold wind, and yet, in this moment, clarity emerged. Courage was not measured by survival alone, but by the willingness to act when everything was uncertain. Lightning flashed far on the horizon, a fleeting reminder that the storm's power lingered beyond what the eye could see. The giant woman moved closer, her towering presence an anchor in the canyon's treacherous expanse. He felt the pull of responsibility tighten, not as a burden, but as a moral compass pointing toward a path he could not abandon. He gestured toward the narrower ledge leading up the cliff, signaling a direction, a plan. The woman nodded, her massive hands adjusting the strap of the makeshift pack she carried, prepared to follow wherever he led. The choice had been made protection, not retreat. action, not cowardice. The canyon, with all its hidden dangers, had become both trial and crucible. Every movement was deliberate as they descended along the wet rock, the cowboy guiding her with subtle touches, silent cues, a choreography born of trust and necessity. Each step carried them deeper into uncertainty, yet also closer to understanding, the understanding that morality often demanded risk, that honor often required defiance of self-preservation. The giant woman paused at a sudden drop, massive frame tense, as if measuring the consequences of misstep. The cowboy placed a steadying hand against her shoulder, an unspoken acknowledgement. The choice to protect was not without danger, and yet retreat was no longer an option. In the canyon's quiet, the echoes of the storm still lingered, but a new rhythm began to emerge. A cadence of courage, trust, and shared purpose. The cowboy felt a shift within himself, the heavy shadow of past failures lifting slightly, replaced by resolve. He understood now that moral choices were rarely easy, often painful, but the act of choosing to stand, to protect, to act. This was the measure of a man. The giant woman met his eyes, and in that silent exchange, a promise was forged. That they would face whatever lay ahead together, that danger would be met with strategy, strength, and unyielding resolve. The canyon's jagged walls bore witness to this unspoken pact, the wind whispering approval, the valley holding its breath. And as they moved deeper into the shadowed gorge, the cowboy felt the weight of destiny pressing gently upon his shoulders. The moral crossroads had been crossed, but the path beyond was fraught with peril, wolves, hunters, and the unknown. Yet for the first time in years he did not fear the journey. He had chosen, and that choice would define the dawn yet to come. The canyon narrowed, walls rising on either side like ancient sentinels, jagged and slick from the rain. The air was heavy with the scent of whetstone and pine, and the distant rumble of water over rocks whispered a constant warning. One misstep, one hesitation, and the world could claim them. The cowboy moved with deliberate care, eyes scanning every shadow, every edge, every subtle shift in the mist that clung to the gorge like a living thing. The giant woman followed closely, each step measured and precise. Her eyes swept the canyon floor, noting obstacles and hidden dangers with uncanny perception. She was immense, powerful, yet her movements carried the elegance of someone attuned to the world, a predator in harmony with her surroundings. The cowboy marveled quietly, a sense of awe mingling with the weight of responsibility. He thought of the past, the countless nights alone, the debts unpaid, the faces of those he had failed. Each memory was a ghost whispering doubts, yet here, in the quiet tension of the canyon, a new clarity emerged. Courage, he realized, was not merely survival. It was choosing to act when the odds were stacked, to face fear with steady hands and an unwavering heart. And today, that courage was measured in the life of another. A sudden gust of wind swept through the gorge, rattling loose stones and sending a shiver down his spine. The giant woman's hair whipped across her face, but she remained steady, her posture unyielding. She turned toward him, dark eyes locking with his, and in that silent gaze he understood something vital. They were equals in this moment of vulnerability, bound by necessity and the unspoken code of trust. They reached a narrow ledge, slick and uneven, where the canyon opened into a small alcove. The cowboy paused, assessing the drop below, the potential paths forward, and the unseen threats that may lie in wait. He gestured toward the giant woman, careful to communicate patience and strategy without words. She nodded, her massive frame adjusting with fluid precision as she followed his subtle instructions. As they moved together along the ledge, the cowboy reflected on the paradox of the frontier. Danger lurked everywhere, yet it was choice, not circumstance, that defined a man's worth. To abandon her now would be to betray the moral compass that had guided him through years of loss and solitude. To act, to protect, to endure, this was the measure of courage, and he would not fail. The giant woman's voice rose in a low, melodic tone, words foreign yet urgent, her gestures precise. He followed, matching her rhythm, mirroring her signals, building a bridge of understanding in the silence. Every shared glance, every subtle nod, every movement became a covenant of survival. In the mist and shadow, trust was forged not by words, but by action. A crack of distant thunder reminded them that the storm had not fully passed, that the world remained unpredictable, and that danger could arrive at any moment. Yet the cowboy felt a quiet resolve. He had chosen this path. He had chosen to stand, and with her by his side, the uncertainty became a challenge to meet, not a terror to flee. They paused briefly in the alcove, catching their breath, listening to the soft patter of water dripping from the rocks above. The cowboy's eyes met hers once more, and in that gaze was a silent promise that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with honor, with strategy, and with unwavering commitment. She responded with a slow, deliberate nod, a signal that the trust was reciprocated, that the moral crossroads had been crossed together. The canyon's walls echoed with the sound of their movements, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk circling high above. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with peril, yet the choice had been made. Courage was no longer a question of personal survival. It was a measure of moral integrity, a declaration that they would act when all seemed lost. As they continued deeper into the shadowed gorge, the cowboy felt the pull of destiny, subtle yet insistent, guiding each step, each decision. The moral crossroads had been faced and navigated, but the true test lay ahead. Every choice, every act would be measured not by the ease of the path, but by the courage to see it through. And in that quiet, rain-washed canyon with the giant woman at his side, he felt the first real stirrings of hope, a fragile, luminous ember in a world still shrouded in uncertainty. The sun bore down on the valley, relentless and harsh, turning the dirt road into a shimmering haze of heat and dust. Vultures circled lazily overhead, riding invisible currents, their keen eyes scanning the earth for movement, for weakness. Cowboy and the giant woman moved cautiously through the abandoned mining town, buildings leaning and crumbling, their windows empty like hollow eyes. Silence hung over the place, thick and oppressive, carrying the faint echoes of long, forgotten labor, of men who had dreamed and failed, leaving only dust and memory behind. She paused at the edge of a collapsed storefront, massive hands brushing away layers of grime, revealing faded paint and chipped wood. The gesture was almost reverential, careful not to disturb the remnants of a life long gone. The cowboy watched her, noticing how even in ruins her presence brought an energy that seemed to defy the decay around them. She was both monument and motion, a living embodiment of strength tempered by grace. As they entered the main street, the giant woman began to speak, her low, melodic voice rising and falling in a cadence the cowboy could not yet decipher. Her gestures were deliberate, pointing toward old carvings on walls, marks etched into beams, patterns worn smooth by decades. It became clear that she was recounting something, her lineage, her past, the truth of who she was. The cowboy listened intently, piecing together meaning from tone, emphasis, and gesture. Slowly, the realization emerged: she was no ordinary woman. She was the last heir of a warrior tribe, a lineage hunted, dispersed, nearly erased. Her words carried the weight of history, of battles fought and lost, of families torn apart by outsiders who had coveted their lands, their strength, their secrets. Each gesture, each accented word, was a thread connecting her to a legacy far greater than any he had known. The heat of the day pressed upon them, dust rising from the dry earth beneath their boots, curling around their legs, carrying with it a sense of vigilance, of unseen eyes. The cowboy felt it, the weight of being watched, of danger that lurked not just in open confrontation, but in betrayal hidden behind familiar faces. The giant woman's story hinted at enemies cloaked in friendship, at allies whose loyalty might be only skin, deep, waiting for the right moment to strike. She paused near a broken water trough, and the cowboy caught her glance, dark, intense, a mix of warning and sorrow. The canyon and mountains had been dangerous, yes, but now the threats were subtler, more insidious. The world beyond the ridge was filled with men who measured power in blood and deceit. Her tribe had known this long before he had, and now he understood. The wolf packs, the storms, they were only the beginning of the trials they would face. He crouched beside her, lowering himself to examine the dust, strewn ground, scanning for tracks, signs, movement. She pointed to a pattern in the dirt, then traced it with a massive finger, a symbol almost forgotten yet precise in its meaning. He recognized the intention immediately. She was marking territory, noting the passage of those who had come before, the hunters who still might follow. Her knowledge of survival was intimate, ancient, honed by generations. The cowboy felt a surge of awe and unease. This was no ordinary rescue. He had stepped into a story that spanned lifetimes, where every act of courage carried consequence, every moment of trust demanded vigilance. And in the center of it stood this woman, a living testament to endurance, strategy, and the unbroken line of a people hunted nearly to extinction. The abandoned town seemed to hold its breath around them, every crumbling building a witness to secrets both lost and remembered. The wind stirred the dust, sending faint clouds rising like ghosts, carrying the scent of dry earth and decay. It felt alive, as if the very stones remembered the struggles that had shaped this land, and were now observing the newcomer who dared step into the tale. She gestured again, tracing more symbols, speaking with urgency in her low, resonant tone. The cowboy followed closely, matching her movements, attentive to her unspoken meaning. Each revelation sharpened the tension. Each secret unearthed brought clarity and danger in equal measure. It became evident that the enemy was not only those who hunted with brute force, but also those who could manipulate, deceive, and betray with quiet precision. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the cracked windows, broken roofs, and dust-choked streets, revealing the scope of the place's abandonment. And in the midst of ruin, the cowboy felt the truth settle heavily upon him. Their path forward was no longer just survival. It was strategy, trust, and vigilance against a world that would not forgive weakness. The giant woman's eyes met his, dark and unwavering. He understood then that the choices ahead required more than courage. They demanded insight, cunning, and the recognition that betrayal could come not only from strangers, but from those who seemed most loyal. The lesson of her lineage, her past, was clear. Power was not only in size or strength, but in knowledge, alliances, and the careful reading of every shadow. The wind stirred once more, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of danger, the promise of confrontation, the reminder that even in ruins the world was alive, and the story was far from over. And as the cowboy rose, adjusting his hat and glancing toward the horizon, he knew that the path forward would test every measure of his resolve, every ounce of his moral code, and every instinct he possessed. The giant woman followed, each step measured, deliberate, an embodiment of both past and future, a living link to a lineage that demanded protection, understanding, and unwavering commitment. The abandoned town became a crucible, the dust beneath their boots a testament to the trials yet to come, and the heat of noon a relentless reminder. Secrets had weight, and knowledge was as powerful as any weapon. The sun blazed mercilessly over the valley, painting the broken town in harsh, golden light. Dust swirled in eddies around the abandoned buildings, carrying whispers of lives long vanished, of ambitions buried beneath stone and timber. The cowboy and the giant woman moved carefully, each step deliberate, aware that the ruins held more than echoes. They held eyes, silent and unseen, waiting for a misstep. She stopped at the edge of a collapsed saloon, her towering frame silhouetted against the broken roof. Fingers tracing symbols etched into the wood, she spoke in her melodic tongue, voice low and urgent. The cowboy could not understand the words, but the intensity, the rhythm, the insistence was unmistakable. She was recounting truths, histories, betrayals, the story of her people hunted, scattered, erased by those who coveted power. Every gesture, every accentuated syllable held weight. The cowboy knelt beside her, scanning the ground, the debris, the faint tracks left by those who had passed through. It was clear, not all who had come before were enemies, but not all were allies either. Betrayal lingered in corners, in shadows, in the spaces between trust and doubt. He understood then that survival was no longer enough. Strategy, perception, and vigilance were now the currency of life. She reached out, massive hand brushing a layer of dust from a cracked table, revealing the faded remnants of a warrior's mark, a symbol of allegiance, of lineage. The cowboy's eyes followed, recognizing the significance. She was the last heir, the living link to a tribe whose name had been whispered in fear and respect, now almost lost to time. Every motion she made emphasized her claim, her heritage, the weight of responsibility she bore. The heat pressed down, oppressive and suffocating, dust clinging to sweat, slicked skin. Vultures circled overhead, indifferent observers to a story unfolding far below. Yet in that oppressive air, a subtle tension took root. They were not alone. Eyes watched from hidden alcoves, from gaps in the crumbling walls. Some were curious, others waited for weakness, for the moment to strike. The cowboy's hand hovered near his rifle, instincts sharpening with every movement. The giant woman's gaze swept the town, alert, calculating. Her voice rose in urgent tones, her gestures precise, indicating paths, dangers, and unseen passages. The cowboy followed, each motion mirrored, each subtle signal interpreted. Their rhythm was becoming seamless, silent understanding born of necessity, trust forged in danger. A sudden movement caught his eye, a shadow slipping across the cracked boards of a building, swift, silent. He tensed, hand tightening on his rifle, heart pounding with adrenaline. The giant woman sensed it immediately, muscles coiling, eyes narrowing, a growl low in her throat that spoke of warning and readiness. The shadow paused, then retreated into the ruins, leaving a lingering sense of unease. They're here, he thought, voiceless, understanding that the threats she had spoken of were not just tales of the past. They lingered, patient and watching. Allies and enemies could not yet be distinguished, but deception and danger were closer than ever. She turned to him, eyes locking in mutual recognition. There was no need for words. The revelation of her lineage, the awareness of enemies lurking, and the silent vow of protection united them. Trust, forged through shared peril, was now an unspoken command. Act decisively, remain vigilant, and honor the bond that had been forged in the shadow of death. The cowboy adjusted his pack, scanning the town once more, noting vantage points, potential ambush spots, and paths for retreat if needed. Every step forward would be a test, not only of skill, but of moral courage, of the ability to navigate a world in which loyalty and betrayal were often indistinguishable. The giant woman followed, her massive presence both shield and warning, her movements precise, graceful, and commanding. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the heat and dust intensified, yet the two moved with deliberate intent, uncovering hidden truths, mapping threats, and cementing the fragile trust that bound them together. The abandoned mining town had become more than a refuge. It was a crucible, a place where secrets, danger, and courage collided, shaping the path they must take next. The cowboy glanced at her, and in that moment, he understood fully. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. To survive, to protect, to honor the lineage she carried, he would need every ounce of skill, every shred of courage, and every measure of moral conviction. The dust, choked valley whispered its warning. Secrets had power, and the choices they made now would echo far beyond the crumbling walls. And as they moved toward the edge of the town, shadows stretching long and ominous beneath the harsh sun, the cowboy knew that the next trials awaited. Clashes of loyalty, tests of courage, and confrontations that would demand not only strength, but the wisdom to discern friend from foe. The clouds had gathered fast over the mountains, dark and swollen with unspent rain, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and ozone. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and threatening, a drumbeat echoing across the valley that seemed to match the cowboy's own heartbeat. The abandoned town behind them was quiet now, dust settling in muted waves, but the tension lingered, alive and electric. Danger was near, though unseen, and every shadow carried the promise of confrontation. The cowboy crouched behind a toppled cart, eyes scanning the ridges above the valley. His rifle rested across his knees, steady and ready. Beside him, the giant woman's immense frame mirrored his vigilance. She shifted slightly, muscles coiled like a bowstring, eyes narrowing at every subtle movement, the brush stirring, the wind carrying a scent too deliberate to be natural. He realized then that their presence had already been noted, that the word of her survival had traveled faster than the wind itself. The stakes had changed. Last night's rescue was no longer a solitary act of courage. It had become a declaration. Blood debts and ancient codes were awakening. Warriors of distant tribes, outsiders hungry for advantage, hunters motivated by greed and revenge, all were converging toward them. The cowboy's mind raced, cataloging possibilities, anticipating threats, measuring the odds of every choice. The giant woman's voice rose in a low, commanding tone. Though he could not understand the words, the urgency was unmistakable. She gestured to a narrow canyon path leading to higher ground, a tactical vantage, a place where advantage could be seized and defense established. He followed without hesitation, understanding the unspoken strategy, preparation before confrontation, intelligence before force. Rain began to fall, first in tentative drops, then in steady sheets that slicked the earth and transformed the valley floor into a treacherous labyrinth of mud and stone. Each step was measured, deliberate, as they moved toward the canyon's edge. The storm mirrored the tension in the air, the rising chaos, the gathering of forces, the inevitability of a clash that could not be avoided. The cowboy thought of the blood debts whispered in stories passed down by those who had fought and died on these lands. Honor demanded reckoning. Every action had consequence. Every mercy, every hesitation could be measured in the currency of pain, betrayal, and vengeance. And now that reckoning was at their doorstep. They reached a narrow ledge above the valley, the rain pounding down in relentless rhythm. From this vantage, the cowboy could see movement far below, shapes darting between rocks, the flash of metal, faint glimmers of awareness that told him their enemies were already positioning. His hands tightened on the rifle, fingers brushing against the leather, each muscle in his body tuned to anticipation. The giant woman beside him mirrored his intensity, her dark eyes sweeping the valley, every gesture precise, every instinct sharp. He considered the traps and strategies he might employ. Fallen logs, slick rock paths, narrow ledges that could turn an attacker's momentum against them. Every natural feature of the canyon became a tool, a weapon, a line of defense. And in the giant woman, he saw not only an ally, but a living force whose very presence altered the dynamics of the battlefield. Strength alone could not win, but cunning, coordination, and courage could tip the scales. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the valley in stark, silver brilliance. In that fleeting flash, he caught the eyes of a scout creeping along the lower rocks, a reminder that the enemy was patient, calculating, and deadly. The giant woman's growl rose softly, a warning resonating from deep within her chest, a sound that carried authority and promise of retaliation. The cowboy nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of readiness. They would not flee, they would not cower. Every choice made from this moment on would carry weight, the reckoning of the blood debt unavoidable. Strategy, patience, and raw courage would decide who would survive the storm, both literal and moral, that now swept across the valley. Rain poured harder, washing the dust from the earth and sending torrents down narrow gullies. Visibility decreased, and yet the tension only sharpened. Every sound became amplified, The snap of a branch, the whisper of wind through the canyon, the distant cries of predators sensing opportunity. The cowboy felt alive in a way that solitude and peace had never granted him. Here, in the rising storm, in the shadow of vengeance, his purpose was absolute: protect, survive, and honor the moral code he had embraced. He glanced at the giant woman once more. She met his gaze, massive shoulders squared, hands clenched, eyes burning with intensity. Trust had become action, courage had become strategy. And together they would face the storm, the enemies, the blood debts, the rising chaos that sought to test them both beyond endurance. Above them, the sky split with lightning, thunder crashing as if heralding the inevitable clash. The cowboy tightened his grip, inhaled the scent of rain and mud, and allowed the surge of anticipation to focus his senses. The blood debt had been called, the storm was rising, and the valley would bear witness to a confrontation of skill, will, and unyielding courage. The rain hammered the valley, turning the ground into a slick battlefield of mud and stone. Rivers of water ran in jagged channels, carrying debris and the scent of damp earth, filling the air with the promise of chaos. The cowboy crouched behind a jagged boulder, muscles coiled, senses alive to every sound. The snap of a branch, the whisper of wind, the faint splash of someone crossing the shallow stream below. Every second was charged, every movement weighed with consequence. The giant woman stood beside him, towering and immense, her form almost a part of the storm itself. Rain slicked her hair, clinging to her shoulders, and her eyes burned with focus, scanning the valley below for threats. Her growl was low, resonating through the wet air, a warning that even the most cunning predator would hesitate to ignore. She was not merely an ally, she was a force of nature, her presence reshaping the battlefield with sheer magnitude. The cowboy's mind raced, mapping strategy across the valley, anticipating paths, choke points, ambush locations. Every natural feature, the narrow ledges, the fallen logs, the muddy slopes, became a weapon in their arsenal. He understood that brute force alone could not win this fight. Tactics, patience, and the ability to read the enemy's intent would decide the outcome. Movement flickered in the distance, shadows weaving between rocks, the glint of metal catching faint light through the rain. Scouts, messengers of vengeance, moving with deliberate caution. The cowboy signaled subtly, a tilt of his head, a hand against the boulder, and the giant woman mirrored his movements, a silent, synchronized understanding between them. They were ready, each anticipating the other's actions, each aware that failure could mean death. Thunder split the sky, rattling the valley, and in its echo, the cowboy felt the rising pulse of fury. Not only his own, but that of the giant woman and the blood debts they carried. This confrontation was not simply survival. It was a reckoning. Ancient codes demanded it, honor required it, and vengeance called across the mountains. He adjusted his rifle, feeling the leather and cold metal grounding him, steadying his nerves. The giant woman flexed her fingers, massive and strong, ready to act, to strike, to defend. She turned to him, eyes locking with his, and he knew no words were needed. They would act as one, their movements a single, lethal force. The first of the enemy approached a narrow pass, unaware that every step was observed, every motion calculated. The cowboy's finger brushed the trigger, a heartbeat away from action. The giant woman shifted slightly, her shadow stretching across the slick rocks, a silent warning that the hunter had become the hunted. A flash of lightning illuminated the valley, revealing their positions in stark clarity. In the deluge, the cowboy's mind sharpened. He remembered the wolf pack, the nights alone, the losses endured, all training for this moment. Every lesson, every survival instinct converged into a single focus: protect, strike, survive, and honor the unbroken code that had brought them here. The storm mirrored the turmoil of vengeance, the chaos of confrontation, and the inevitability of blood debts being claimed. The first shots rang out, sharp and echoing across the valley, a symphony of chaos against the storm's own percussion. The cowboy moved instinctively, rifle swinging, feet finding traction on mud, slick stone. The giant woman followed, a tower of force and precision, each movement calculated, every strike echoing centuries of warrior lineage. Rain pounded their backs, wind whipped around them, and yet in the storm they were calm, deliberate, unstoppable. The clash escalated rapidly. Shadows of attackers multiplied, moving with lethal intent. Yet each was met with strategy, strength, and the fierce resolve of two who had embraced the moral weight of courage. Every moment was a balance between offense and defense, between survival and vengeance, between the chaos of battle and the discipline of purpose. Lightning illuminated the valley again, revealing more of the enemy converging, now aware that their prey was prepared, that the debt they had sought to collect would not be taken lightly. The cowboy's heart pounded in rhythm with the storm, and he felt the thrill of the battle, terrifying, raw, and morally justified. This was the reckoning of the blood debt, the collision of fury and honor, and they would meet it fully with unwavering courage. As the rain-soaked battle raged, the cowboy caught a fleeting glimpse of her eyes, fierce, unyielding, a reminder that lineage and legacy demanded defense, demanded victory. Every strike, every maneuver, every heartbeat carried weight. And together they forged a path through the chaos, honoring their code, exacting justice, and surviving against the rising storm of men and fury alike. And in the heart of that tempest, the cowboy understood fully. Vengeance alone was empty without strategy. Fury without moral purpose was chaos, and the true measure of strength was the steadfastness of heart, even when the world and the storm seemed determined to break it. Dusk crept across the valley, painting the sky in bruised purples and molten gold, shadows stretching long across mud, slick rocks and broken timber. Smoke curled from smoldering fires set during the earlier skirmishes, drifting like ghosts across the battlefield. The cowboy crouched behind a jagged boulder, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the horizon where 200 warriors had gathered, their armor glinting faintly in the dying light. Every heartbeat carried tension, every breath a silent prayer for skill, for strategy, for survival. The giant woman stood beside him, immense and unyielding, her silhouette monumental against the twilight. Rain from the earlier storm still clung to her hair and shoulders, gleaming in the waning light. Her eyes swept the field, analyzing, calculating, a living embodiment of her tribe's history of battles won and lives defended. The cowboy felt the weight of their odds pressing down, yet in her presence there was no room for fear, only focus, clarity, and fierce determination. He adjusted his rifle, scanning the enemy lines, noting weak points, formations, and the subtle signals of command. The warriors ahead were disciplined, their numbers intimidating, yet the cowboy's mind raced through possibilities, traps, choke points, clever maneuvers that could level the field despite overwhelming odds. Every decision was moral as well as tactical. He must defend the giant woman, honor her lineage, and survive the onslaught without succumbing to vengeance or reckless fury. A war horn sounded faintly in the distance, carried by the wind and echoing across the valley. The signal was clear. The enemy was ready, organized, and prepared for confrontation. The cowboy's heart quickened, and yet he remained steady, drawing on years of solitude, hardship, and moral resolve. In the distance, the warriors advanced, boots striking the wet earth, weapons glinting, banners snapping in the cold evening wind. The giant woman shifted, planting her massive feet firmly on the ground. She rose above the surrounding terrain, her stature both commanding and protective. A low growl escaped her throat, reverberating through the valley, a warning to those who dared underestimate her presence. The cowboy watched, silent, knowing that her strength and strategy would be the fulcrum of their survival. He could only complement it with precision, patience, and moral clarity. First wave of attackers approached the narrow pass where the cowboy had prepared traps and hidden lines of defense. Lightning flickered faintly from the storm now dissipating to the west, illuminating their faces and glinting off steel. The cowboy took aim, breath steady, calculating distance and angle, feeling the rhythm of battle sync with his own heartbeat. Beside him, the giant woman moved with a predator's grace, deflecting, striking, and positioning with an elegance that belied her immense size. Chaos erupted. Clashing metal, shouted commands, and the roar of hundreds of voices filled the valley, mixing with the echo of falling stones and snapping branches. The cowboy fired, each shot precise, each movement intentional, as the giant woman charged forward, towering over the enemy, her presence alone reshaping the battlefield. The moral weight of their actions was evident. This was justice, honor, and survival intertwined. Every strike, every defense, carried meaning, and every life spared or taken resonated with consequence. Amid the chaos, the cowboy noticed subtle shifts in loyalty. Warriors hesitated, uncertain where allegiance truly lay. The giant woman's commanding presence and unwavering resolve began to influence even the hesitant, her authority undeniable. He realized then that strength was more than physical. It was moral, strategic, and visible to all who bore witness. Lightning split the sky again, briefly illuminating the entire valley, revealing the full scale of the confrontation. Smoke, mud, desperate movement, and yet, in the midst of turmoil, clarity emerged. The cowboy and the giant woman were no longer merely defending themselves. They were defining the terms of justice for those who would follow. For those who sought to honor courage and lineage above raw numbers. A volley of arrows streaked across the twilight, but the giant woman's movements were fluid, almost preternatural, deflecting, dodging, asserting control over the chaos. The cowboy's shots found their marks, but more importantly, his actions complemented hers, creating a rhythm of offense and defense that gradually shifted momentum. They were no longer outnumbered. They were orchestrating the battlefield, turning numbers into shadows and chaos into strategy. The cowboy paused for a moment, heart pounding, eyes scanning the horizon. He felt the weight of every life around him, the enemy, the allies, the innocent caught in proximity. Every decision carried moral consequence, and yet he had embraced the responsibility. Courage was not merely surviving. It was acting rightly, decisively, and with honor, even in the face of impossible odds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in deep purple and orange hues, the first wave faltered, confusion rippling through the enemy lines. The cowboy and the giant woman pressed forward, combining intellect, strength, and moral resolve. The reckoning had begun in earnest, and by nightfall the valley would bear witness to courage tested, debts confronted, and honor upheld against all opposition. Night fell abruptly over the valley, the sky a deep ink, stained black, pierced only by flickers of lightning and the dying glow of fires scattered across the battlefield. Smoke curled upward, twisting into the heavy air, carrying with it the scent of mud, sweat, and iron. The sounds of combat persisted, shouts, clashing steel, and the low, threatening growl of the giant woman echoing through the chaos. Every heartbeat in the cowboy's chest matched the rhythm of the storm, the pulse of the valley, the drumbeat of survival and justice colliding. From their vantage atop the narrow ledge, the cowboy and the giant woman observed the enemy ranks. 200 warriors, disciplined and determined, pressed forward, unaware that their momentum was now being carefully manipulated. The cowboy's fingers brushed the rifle, steady, deliberate. Beside him, she shifted, a living colossus of fury and strategy, her massive presence dictating the flow of battle. They were no longer reacting. They were orchestrating. He noted the subtle fractures among the enemy lines, hesitant movements betraying indecision, eyes flicking toward her as if drawn to the undeniable command she radiated. The cowboy's heart swelled with both awe and resolve. This was more than combat. It was a demonstration of honor, lineage, and the moral code that demanded courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The first clash erupted at the valley floor below. A surge of attackers charged a narrow choke point, only to find the ground treacherous, slick from rain and debris. Rocks shifted beneath their feet, unsteady, while arrows and well-laced shots from the cowboy picked off stragglers with precision. Above them, the giant woman descended like a storm incarnate, her immense hands sweeping aside those foolish enough to underestimate her reach. Her voice a deep, commanding growl that sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks. Chaos rippled outward, confusion mounting, yet the cowboy and the giant woman moved in perfect unison, responding instinctively to threats, creating a rhythm of offense and defense that the enemy could neither anticipate nor counter. Every strike was measured, every movement deliberate, blending physical power with strategic foresight. It was a ballet of fury and morality, of instinct and intellect, executed under the oppressive night sky and the heavy scent of rain-drenched earth. The cowboy's mind flashed back to the wolf pack, the first moments of their encounter, the sudden leap into danger without hesitation. Every lesson learned in solitude, every test endured on the frontier, converged here. Courage was more than impulse. It was reason, timing, and ethical action combined. And beside him, the giant woman exemplified every principle of strength, honor, and lineage, guiding him with presence alone. A war cry rose from the enemy ranks, but hesitation had begun to fester. Those who had once advanced with certainty now faltered under the weight of her imposing form and the precision of the cowboy's attacks. Their strategy unraveled as chaos and fear crept into their ranks. The giant woman seized the moment, asserting dominance, crushing both momentum and morale with every deliberate movement. The cowboy took careful aim at a cluster attempting to regroup, letting the rifle speak where words could not. One by one, the opposition fell into disarray, their coordination faltering, leaving gaps that could be exploited. It was not savagery but justice, calculated and moral, the exacting of consequence against those who would threaten lineage, honor, and life itself. Lightning illuminated the valley again, revealing the full scope of their orchestration. The enemy's numbers, once intimidating, now seemed fractured, shadows among shadows, moving uncertainly against a force that balanced strength and morality with uncanny precision. The cowboy exhaled slowly, allowing the clarity of purpose to fill him, each breath syncing with the cadence of survival and justice intertwined. The giant woman turned, massive frame towering over the valley floor, eyes scanning for the final resistances, hands poised to act, voice issuing low warnings that carried over the din of battle. And in that moment, the cowboy understood fully, victory would not come merely from firepower or size, but from resolve, strategy, and the unwavering adherence to the moral compass that had brought them here. The night pressed on, the clash reaching its peak, and the valley became a crucible where loyalty, courage, and lineage were tested beyond endurance. By the time the moon rose high, the enemy lines had fractured entirely. Survivors recognized the inevitability of judgment and the authority of the giant woman's lineage, reinforced by the cowboy's steadfast courage. And as the dust settled, the fires burned low, and the valley echoed with the aftermath of the confrontation, both knew that the reckoning had passed its zenith. Justice had been asserted, not through brute force alone, but through strategy, honor, and the fusion of heart and strength. The cowboy and the giant woman stood amid the echoes, battered yet unbroken, a testament to the enduring power of courage tempered by moral conviction. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, soft amber spilling across the valley, brushing the charred remnants of the battlefield with gentle warmth. Mist lingered in the low hollows, curling around shattered timber and scattered rocks, carrying the quiet hush of aftermath. The cowboy rose slowly, shoulders stiff from the night's struggle, eyes scanning the valley that had been transformed by courage, strategy, and moral resolve. The air was thick with the scent of rain, soaked earth, smoke, and iron, yet beneath it lay a subtle promise, a reckoning complete, a balance restored. Beside him, the giant woman moved deliberately, massive feet pressing into the mud, each step careful, measured, yet undeniably commanding. Her eyes, still fierce, softened slightly as she surveyed the battlefield. Survivors, both enemy and ally, had begun to stir, shaken but aware of the new order imposed by the night's confrontation. The valley no longer belonged solely to the bold or the brutal. It belonged to justice, exacted through strategy, courage, and adherence to moral principle. The cowboy exhaled, feeling the tension ease slightly, though vigilance remained. The blood debt had been called and met, the enemy lines fractured, and those who had survived now recognized the authority of the giant woman's lineage, reinforced by his unwavering resolve. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the wet ground, observing the careful tending of wounds, the quiet reconciliation among those who had been driven to violence by circumstance or fear. Sunlight pierced the mist, illuminating faces streaked with soot and mud, eyes reflecting relief and awe. The giant woman lowered her massive form to the ground, gathering scattered weapons and returning them to those who had fought with honor, a silent acknowledgment that justice was tempered with mercy. The cowboy followed, assisting in what little he could, his presence steadying, reminding all that courage must be paired with discernment. From the ridge above, the valley seemed almost peaceful, yet every observer sensed the moral gravity of the night's events. Lives had been spared, debts repaid, honor asserted, and yet the weight of the ordeal lingered. The cowboy and the giant woman shared a brief, understanding glance, silent recognition of the path they had walked together, of choices made under pressure, and of the code that guided them through blood, chaos, and storm. The survivors, once divided by fear and loyalty, now began tentative gestures of alliance. They tended wounds, shared water, and exchanged cautious words. Trust, fragile yet burgeoning, grew in the shadow of the devastation. And as the morning light deepened, a profound realization took hold. Justice had not been delivered through sheer force alone, but through intellect, courage, and a moral clarity that could not be ignored. The cowboy moved among them, observing carefully. Some who had hesitated now approached with tentative respect, recognizing that raw numbers were meaningless against a combination of skill, strategy, and moral conviction. The giant woman stood as a beacon of rightful authority, her lineage recognized, her strength acknowledged, and her role as protector affirmed. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, and with it, a sense of resolution. The battle had ended, but its lessons remained. Courage was measured not in victories alone, but in the fidelity to one's moral compass, in the discernment to act justly, and in the patience to wield power wisely. The cowboy's gaze shifted to the horizon, sunlight glinting off his rifle, highlighting both the scars of combat and the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. In the valley's quiet, the giant woman spoke in her low, resonant voice, words untranslatable yet filled with meaning. Her gestures indicated reconciliation, care, and guidance. The cowboy nodded, understanding fully. The dawn of justice was not only a conclusion but also a beginning, a new order where honor, lineage, and courage shaped the landscape as much as rivers or mountains ever could. As the morning sun climbed higher, the cowboy felt the weight of relief, of triumph, and of moral resolution settle upon him. The valley, once a theater of vengeance and chaos, now became a testament to justice tempered with wisdom. Every motion, every glance, every breath carried the quiet victory of order, courage, and ethical resolve. And in that luminous, mist-strapped dawn, the cowboy and the giant woman stood side by side, titanic figures in a valley where courage had faced its ultimate test, where morality had been weighed against survival, and where justice had emerged not as vengeance, but as the rightful order restored by those willing to act with both strength and heart. Sunlight spread fully across the valley, burning away the last vestiges of mist and shadow. The battlefield, once a maelstrom of fury, now lay quiet, broken only by the soft murmurs of survivors and the rustle of wind through wet grass. The cowboy moved carefully, observing the wounded and weary, offering silent acknowledgment where words were unnecessary. Every gesture mattered, every look could convey mercy, resolve, or warning. Justice, he knew, was as much in restraint as it was in action. The giant woman stepped forward, her immense presence demanding attention. Survivors hesitated before her, fear tempered by awe. Her lineage, once whispered in shadows, now shone clearly under the morning sun. The cowboy followed her lead, ensuring that those who had survived understood their choices carried consequences, yet mercy was extended where honor was maintained. This was not triumph for its own sake, but recognition of rightful authority. Groups of warriors who had fled or faltered now returned cautiously, seeking to reconcile and align under the new moral order. The cowboy's eyes swept over them, noting hesitation, respect, and tentative trust. He understood that this was more than survival. It was the forging of alliances, the restoration of balance, and the recognition of power exercised with wisdom and courage. The giant woman moved among the survivors, instructing, guiding, and asserting authority. Her gestures, powerful and deliberate, commanded both attention and respect. The cowboy mirrored her stance, ensuring that the moral and physical weight of their victory was understood. No unnecessary violence remained. All that was left was acknowledgement and order. High above, the sun's rays glinted off the wet rocks and river, casting the valley in golden light. Smoke from scattered fires drifted lazily, carrying the scent of the night's conflict, but it no longer clung to fear or rage. Instead, it mingled with the freshness of rain and the calm of restored balance. The cowboy breathed deeply, feeling the valley exhale alongside him. Every wound tended, every eye meeting his with newfound respect, confirmed that courage coupled with morality could reshape even the darkest night. The giant woman turned her gaze toward the distant ridges, surveying the lands beyond the valley. Her stance suggested vigilance, continuity, and the promise of protection for those under her authority. The cowboy understood without words. Their duty was not yet over, but the immediate threat had passed. They had re-established justice, and the valley itself seemed to acknowledge their triumph. Every blade of grass and stone bearing silent witness. Small gestures of reconciliation began. Warriors offered water, tended the injured, and nodded with respect. The cowboy moved among them, steady and deliberate, reinforcing that courage tempered by honor created not just victory, but trust. The giant woman's presence amplified this truth, her authority now unquestioned, her lineage validated in every glance, every respectful bow, every acknowledgement of survival and justice. As the morning deepened into day, the valley quieted further. Birds cautiously returned, their songs tentative but pure, the first soft notes of life reclaiming the landscape. The cowboy and the giant woman stood together, surveying what remained. Victory was theirs, justice had been restored, and yet the moral order of the valley now demanded vigilance, fairness, and continued courage. The reckoning had passed, but the dawn of justice had only just begun to illuminate the possibilities of what could endure. Sunlight glimmered off the cowboy's rifle, the faint reflection catching the giant woman's eyes. A silent understanding passed between them. This was more than survival. It was the affirmation of principle, the recognition of moral strength, and the quiet triumph of courage exercised wisely. The valley, scarred yet alive, bore witness to the dawn of a new order, one in which honor, strategy, and steadfast heart had prevailed. The valley lay in quiet repose, a stark contrast to the tumult of the past night. Mist clung to the riverbanks, and the first warm beams of sunlight glimmered across wet rocks and grass, turning droplets into tiny prisms of gold. The cowboy moved carefully through the remnants of the battlefield, boots leaving faint impressions in the damp earth. each step deliberate, reflective. His gaze swept over the injured, the weary, the silent faces that had once fought with fury, now softened by the relief of survival. Beside him, the giant woman moved with purpose yet gentleness, her immense form a shield over the vulnerable, her presence a reminder that power tempered with mercy could reshape destinies. Survivors of the previous night's confrontation began to stir, exchanging cautious glances, hesitant gestures, and quiet acknowledgments. The valley, once scarred by chaos, now seemed to hum with the subtle rhythm of healing. The cowboy knelt by a wounded warrior, tending to a gash with practiced care, his fingers steady despite the lingering adrenaline. There was no distinction now between friend or foe, only humanity, fragile yet enduring, and the moral imperative to preserve it. The giant woman stood nearby, her eyes scanning the perimeter, a living sentinel, yet her posture softened when she witnessed acts of reconciliation, understanding that strength also resided in fostering trust. Low murmurs of conversation rose among the survivors, hesitant yet genuine. Old grudges dissolved under the weight of shared trial, hands extended in apology, gestures of assistance, nods of respect. The cowboy moved through them, silent but commanding, embodying the principle that courage paired with honor could inspire change, even among those who had once opposed him. The giant woman approached a small group of warriors, her hands massive but gentle as she guided them through the proper tending of wounds. Her lineage, once veiled in secrecy and fear, now shone as a beacon of rightful authority. Eyes that had glimmered with mistrust now reflected recognition, awe, and the acceptance of leadership earned through action, not birth alone. The cowboy felt the weight of the night's trials lift slightly, replaced with a quiet satisfaction that stemmed not from victory alone, but from the knowledge that justice had been restored. Every choice made in the valley, from the precise strikes of defense to the restraint exercised in moments of moral temptation, had carried consequence, and now those consequences rippled outward as acts of redemption and reconciliation. Children, previously hidden or frightened by the chaos, began to emerge from the shadows, their eyes wide, observing the aftermath with cautious curiosity. The cowboy and the giant woman allowed them space, yet their presence reminded all that the true measure of courage was not only in battle but in protection, in stewardship of life, in creating a future unburdened by fear. The survivors moved collectively, forming small clusters of aid and conversation. The cowboy lent his strength where needed, moving supplies, assisting the wounded, offering guidance in quiet ways that spoke louder than words. The giant woman's shadow stretched long across the valley, a reminder of the might that had secured peace and the wisdom that now maintained it. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the scent of wet pine and the distant smoke of extinguished fires. In this moment, the cowboy allowed himself to reflect. Redemption was not an end, it was a process, woven through acts of mercy, courage, and honor. Every life spared, every reconciliation offered, every hand extended, became a thread in the tapestry of moral restoration. The valley, once a theater of fury and vengeance, now breathed in harmony. Survivors began sharing stories of bravery, acknowledging deeds done in the heat of battle, forgiving errors made in fear or confusion. The cowboy observed quietly, knowing that trust was fragile yet resilient, and that redemption required both patience and steadfastness. Evening approached, softening the light into warm golden hues. Shadows stretched and intertwined, yet there was no fear in their length, only the calm realization that the reckoning had passed, and a new chapter of life and moral clarity had begun. The cowboy and the giant woman stood side by side, surveying the valley, knowing that the bonds forged in fire and storm would endure, rooted in shared courage, mutual respect, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The golden light of evening softened across the valley, casting long, gentle shadows over the wounded and weary. Survivors moved among one another with tentative respect, their voices low, carrying gratitude, acknowledgement, and the beginnings of trust. The cowboy walked slowly, observing each interaction, understanding that redemption was a delicate balance of action and restraint, of guidance and patience. Every hand offered in aid, every nod of recognition, stitched the torn fabric of the valley back together. The giant woman moved deliberately, her towering presence both awe-inspiring and reassuring. She knelt by a group of injured warriors, offering silent instruction, her immense hands deftly stabilizing bandages and distributing water. Her authority was unquestioned yet tempered with empathy, a demonstration that strength without compassion was hollow. Eyes once filled with fear now reflected reverence and quiet loyalty, as the survivors recognized not just the force that had defeated them, but the justice that had guided it. The cowboy approached a small cluster of men and women, some of whom had once opposed him. Words were unnecessary. He offered steady hands, helping carry supplies, steadying limbs, and sharing the quiet resilience born of survival. In every gesture, he demonstrated that courage and honor were inseparable from responsibility. Those who had doubted him now looked upon him with respect, understanding that his actions had been guided by principle rather than impulse. Children, emerging cautiously from the edges of the valley, observed the scene with wide, curious eyes. The cowboy and giant woman allowed them space, letting the youngest witnesses understand that life could endure, that justice had restored order, and that strength could be wielded to protect rather than destroy. A small girl tentatively approached the giant woman, who lowered herself slowly, her eyes softening, hands extended. The gesture bridged fear with trust, awe with familiarity, establishing a precedent that courage was as much in mercy as in might. The sun dipped lower, casting amber and rose hues over the valley. Survivors gathered near the river, tending wounds, sharing water, and exchanging quiet words of reconciliation. Old grudges dissolved in the wake of shared survival, mistakes born of fear or confusion were acknowledged and forgiven. The cowboy watched, understanding that redemption was not given. It was earned through patience, steadfastness, and moral clarity. The giant woman's gaze swept the valley, her eyes resting on each survivor, silently imparting assurance, protection, and leadership. Her presence was a living testament to the resilience of her lineage, her authority confirmed not by birthright alone, but by the courage and wisdom displayed in the crucible of the battle. The cowboy stood beside her, understanding that their partnership had been solidified through shared trials, mutual respect, and the recognition of each other's strength, both moral and physical. As twilight deepened, the valley exhaled. The battlefield, once a canvas of chaos and blood, now became a place of reflection, healing, and hope. The cowboy and the giant woman walked among the survivors, silent yet commanding, their presence a living reminder that courage, honor, and mercy could coexist. Those who had fled or faltered now approached with tentative reverence, offering assistance, acknowledgement, and willingness to follow the new order established in the valley. The river glinted faintly in the evening light, reflecting the calm that had returned. Birds, once silent, now sang tentative songs, reclaiming the valley with notes of life and renewal. The cowboy's gaze met the giant woman's. In that shared glance lay understanding, partnership, and an unspoken promise. Together, they had faced the storm, restored justice, and nurtured the beginnings of redemption. Night settled fully over the valley, soft and embracing. Fires burned low, casting flickering shadows over the faces of survivors. The cowboy and the giant woman stood side by side atop a small rise, surveying the valley, aware that true victory was measured not in bloodshed, but in the restoration of trust, the fostering of alliances, and the quiet affirmation of moral courage. Redemption had been achieved, not as a fleeting reward, but as the enduring promise that justice tempered with mercy could reshape even the harshest frontier. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of wet pine and smoke, mingling with the faint murmur of reconciled voices. The cowboy exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest, replaced by a steady, enduring pride. Beside him, the giant woman's eyes reflected the same understanding. The valley was no longer merely a place of conflict. It was a testament to courage, honor, and the enduring strength of heart. The plains stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in molten gold and soft amber, the horizon bending like a promise into infinity. The cowboy rode slowly, dust rising from his horse's hooves in lazy clouds, each step measured, deliberate, as if the land itself honored the passage of one who had endured storms both of nature and of the heart. The valley behind him lay quiet now, a memory of chaos transformed into a testament of courage, honor, and moral resolve. He glanced to the ridge where the giant woman had disappeared at dawn, returning to her tribe, her silhouette shrinking against the vast landscape. Her presence had been monumental, both literal and symbolic, embodying strength, justice, and the weight of lineage. The cowboy understood fully that her departure did not diminish the bond forged in fire, and storm had merely transformed it, leaving behind a silent acknowledgement, a moral echo carried across the plains. The wind whispered through tall grass, bending it in waves that mirrored the cowboy's reflective thoughts. Each step forward was a meditation on the choices that had led him here, the leaps of faith into the wolf's circle, the moral dilemmas faced under storm, swept skies, the lives preserved or lost, the debts repaid. Courage, he realized, was not measured in victories or survival alone, but in the steadiness of heart when every option demanded sacrifice. In the distance, the first tendrils of smoke rose from the valley, signaling the survivors rebuilding, tending wounds, sharing water and stories. The cowboy's chest swelled with quiet satisfaction. Redemption and justice were alive here, nurtured not by brute force, but by decisions guided by principle. Every life spared, every wrong acknowledged, every alliance formed was proof that honor was more enduring than any fleeting victory. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across rolling plains, the light shifting with the slow, inevitable passage of time. The cowboy rode on, each motion rhythmic, almost ceremonial, as if the land itself was marking the journey of one who had acted rightly in a world often defined by chaos. The horizon beckoned with unspoken possibility, a canvas for courage tempered by wisdom, strength balanced with compassion. He thought of the wolf pack, the first danger that had set this chain of events in motion. Life had demanded leaps into the unknown, moral clarity under pressure, and steadfast action when hesitation could have meant ruin. And yet, through it all, a singular truth had emerged. The measure of a person was not in size, not in strength, not in the firepower wielded, but in the steadfastness of heart, the courage to act justly when the world offered only uncertainty. The plains stretched endlessly, golden waves of grass rolling beneath a sky that shifted from amber to pale blue. The cowboy exhaled slowly, letting the calm seep into his bones, carrying with it the quiet pride of moral victory. Life on the frontier was harsh, and yet within its trials, the seeds of honor, courage, and redemption flourished for those willing to act with conviction. The giant woman's figure, now distant, remained a moral beacon in memory. Reminder that true strength lay in protecting the vulnerable, in balancing force with mercy, in leading with both courage and principle. The cowboy understood that their paths, though separated now, would forever intersect in the lessons learned, the lives preserved, and the legacy of justice enacted in the valley below. As the horse carried him further across the endless plains, the cowboy felt the weight of solitude, tempered by satisfaction. The story of courage, honor, and redemption would echo across these lands, carried by wind and memory, a quiet testament that morality, when paired with action, could carve a horizon brighter than any sunrise. The sun settled low, casting the plains in a molten glow, shadows stretching long and soft across the rolling grass. The cowboy rode alone, his silhouette a quiet monument against the fading light. Every ridge, every hollow, every distant hill seemed to whisper the echoes of the battles fought, the debts repaid, and the lives touched by courage and conscience. The land remembered what he had done. It carried his deeds in the wind, in the rustle of grass, in the scent of pine and dust. The giant woman had returned to her tribe, but her presence lingered in memory, a living testament to justice tempered with mercy. She had shown the cowboy that true strength was measured not in might alone, but in the wisdom to act rightly, the courage to protect when all seemed lost, and the resolve to uphold honor even when fear whispered otherwise. That lesson rode with him now, every heartbeat echoing with the weight of principle. The cowboy's eyes scanned the horizon, amber light painting the plains with warmth and possibility. The valley behind him, once a theater of chaos and fury, lay transformed, a sanctuary of reconciliation, alliance, and moral clarity. Survivors moved with purpose, rebuilding, tending wounds, and sharing water, their acts small yet monumental, carrying forward the quiet power of redemption. As night approached, the wind shifted gently, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain, of smoke and healing. He breathed it in deeply, feeling the valley's calm settle into his chest. Each step of his horse, each movement across the plains, became a meditation on courage, honor, and moral fortitude. Life on the frontier demanded choices, and in every choice the measure of a man or a woman was revealed. The cowboy thought back to the wolf pack, the first peril that had set the chain of events in motion. That moment of instinct, of risking all for a stranger, had rippled into a cascade of trials, confrontations, and revelations. Yet every trial had been met with courage, every confrontation tempered by principle, every revelation embraced with moral clarity. He understood, as the plains stretched endlessly before him, that true strength was quiet, measured, and enduring. The horizon glowed, streaked with amber and rose, a mirror of the fires that had raged and the dawns that had followed. He rode with the steady rhythm of a heart unshaken by fear, yet fully aware of the fragility and weight of life. The giant woman's lessons remained, etched into memory. Justice was not delivered in fury alone. Redemption was earned through patience and mercy, and courage was most profound when it aligned with honor. And as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, he understood the timeless truth of the frontier. The smallest acts of courage could ripple across mountains and plains. The steadfastness of heart could reshape lives and destinies, and the moral choices made when all seemed lost could echo far beyond the individual, leaving an enduring legacy of honor. The cowboy rode on, the endless plains unfolding before him, the horizon stretching wide and free. In the quiet of that vast land, he felt the enduring resonance of justice, courage, and redemption, a legacy carried not in power or fear, but in the heart willing to act rightly, bravely, and with unwavering principle.